Welcome to Justice in Two Languages.
Welcome back to Justice in Two Languages with attorney David Elias Idinopulos, founder of Elias Law in Albuquerque, New Mexico. David is a bilingual personal injury attorney who has spent decades helping New Mexicans after serious crashes and has seen clear patterns in when, where, and how these collisions tend to happen across the city. I'm Shameika Rhymes, and today we're talking about the most common crashes that David sees in Albuquerque. David is going to talk about what causes them, why certain areas are riskier than others, and what these patterns mean for drivers and families across New Mexico. Welcome back, David.
Thank you so much for having me back, Shameika.
Well, David, Albuquerque sees a wide range of crashes. From your experience, what types of accidents show up most often in the cases that you handle?
It kind of depends on the time of day. If you are talking about like during the day or on the commute, very often what we see are rear end accidents. A lot of those are caused very clearly by texting drivers. If you're talking at night, later, particularly late at night, we're talking largely alcohol, and also dudes in Camaros that are trying to go as fast as they could possibly go because the streets are more wide open. That tends to be Albuquerque. If you're talking about the southern part of the state, say down in Eddy County, down towards Roswell, Artesia, Carlsbad, a lot of what we see are oil field accidents. The oil trucks that are working in the oil field tend to drive at very high speeds because they're trying to get from one job site to the next job site. Those tend to be incredibly high impact, high velocity, very severe crashes. But during the 9 to 5 hour, you're mostly talking about rear end accidents, largely because people are driving a little bit too fast or because people are texting. And that tends to be, for any personal injury attorney, our office included, that tends to be the majority of the crashes. I would say probably 70% of our auto accident cases are exactly like that. Rear end accidents, somebody's texting, somebody's driving a little bit too fast, didn't give themselves enough room to stop, rear ended the vehicle in front of them.
Well, some intersections and stretches of road in the city are known for repeated collisions. So, what kinds of conditions tend to make those certain spots more dangerous than others?
That's a really good question. When you're talking about areas where you see a lot of accidents, almost always those areas are commercial areas. So you have malls, you have stores, you have people pulling out of those stores or people pulling into those stores. A really common accident that we see constantly is somebody is trying to pull out of a store. And so the vehicle immediately next to them in that curb lane will give them room to pull out. They will sometimes pull out wide or pull out into the next intersection or into the next lane of travel, rather. And they only got, quote unquote, permission from the vehicle closest to them, but they did not think that, well, permission from one vehicle in one lane is not permission from another vehicle in another lane. And so they pull out there. Same thing about pulling in. Somebody will leave a gap for somebody to make a left-hand turn into a mall, and the person who left the gap is only speaking for themselves in their lane. They're not speaking for the next vehicle in the next lane. So we see a lot of those accidents. But in general, the kind of accident that I described, we see a lot of that in high commercial traffic areas, around malls, around stores, around restaurants, those kinds of areas.
Well, there's lots of factors that come into this, like speeding, like you mentioned, distracted driving, or the mix of traffic. So, what do you often see when you look at the causes behind everyday crashes?
Yeah, I think any personal injury attorney will tell you now the number one cause of accidents that they see on the road is somebody texting. And often it won't show up in the police report. Nobody's going to admit, yeah, I was texting or something like that. But the reality is, when there is no other explanation, when the road is clear, when the sight lines are long, when visibility is good, and we see that particularly with younger drivers. You get an 18, 19, 20-year-old driver and they don't have a good explanation for why it is that they rear-ended somebody at a red light. It's almost always texting. That's
Mhm.
the big one.
Well, I noticed I was on the interstate the other day and I noticed a woman. I'm just going to demonstrate this real quick. She was driving, like her phone was like this. while she's driving. So she's
Oh,
going
sure.
super
Oh,
slow on the
sure.
interstate. Do you see
Yeah.
that happen a lot too?
Constantly. Well, look, I don't just see it. Everybody sees it. We all know about it. The person that you see up ahead, and all of a sudden they are out of their lane, and then they move back into the lane they're supposed to be in, but they're driving slow, and you get alongside of them, and they are doing exactly that. They're doing they're like, we call them bobbleheads, right? Their heads are going up, their heads are going down. They're bobbleheads, and that's what they're doing. They are texting, and it's not just that they are texting. Sometimes they will be using voice activated text,
Uh,
but they will voice activate text, and then they'll get a response, and then they'll look at it, and they're not looking at the road. So
right.
texting has made driving in New Mexico and every other place in the country, and I presume every other place in the world, exponentially dangerous. Way back in the day, I was a motorcycle rider. I still have a beautiful 1998 Triumph Thunderbird Sport. I don't get on my bike anymore. I don't get on my bike anymore because driving in a city is so much more dangerous now with texting.
Yeah, wow. Well, now let's throw weather into the mix because weather can change fast in New Mexico, especially in the winter or during monsoon season. So, how did those sudden conditions affect the way that accidents unfold on Albuquerque roads?
It depends a lot on where you go. In the city of Albuquerque, during monsoon season, we tend to get rain, and the rains are so furious in monsoon season that tends to slow everyone down. So typically what happens is if you get an accident in monsoon season in Albuquerque, it's not because somebody didn't leave themselves enough room to stop or anything like that. It's because somebody says, "Man, wouldn't it be fun to go through a massive puddle in monsoon season?" They hydroplane, they lose control, and that's how the accident happens. In Albuquerque, we don't tend to see too many accidents caused by rain, too many accidents caused by ice, or I'm sorry, too many accidents caused by snow, too many accidents caused by ice. We do see that on the highways, however, and certainly further north. And even down south, again towards Eddy County, because the wind just comes whipping off the plain there, will freeze whatever moisture is on the road. The other thing that we have a tendency to see on the highways is lots of high wind accidents. So, in New Mexico, for example, they will talk about high wind warnings because high wind warnings will literally blow a semi from his lane into your lane. In a heartbeat, and that's a pretty serious accident. Years ago, I had a case out towards Grants, New Mexico, of a semi driver. The road conditions were terrible. It was very icy, and the semi driver maintained his lane until he decided to pass my client on an overpass. And what happens on an overpass is you get wind whipping across the overpass, you get wind whipping under the overpass, and overpasses have a tendency to freeze before the main road does. So those can be much more icy than the road which led to that overpass. In this particular case, he was passing my client, hit that overpass, immediately fishtailed. Both of them wound up in the ditch, and I had a client who unfortunately wound up with very serious and very life-changing injuries.
Well, for those Spanish speaking families or mixed language households, what kinds of challenges come up right after a crash, whether it's reporting the collision, dealing with officers, or just getting that initial information?
The biggest one is communicating with the officer at the scene of the accident. I would say in general, New Mexico has a higher percentage of bilingual officers than most other states. I know that you are located in Charlotte. I'm here in Albuquerque. We have a lot more. I would dare to say a lot more bilingual officers here in New Mexico than exist in Charlotte. But nevertheless, a lot of times when a Spanish-speaking client gets into an accident, they may have difficulty explaining how the accident happened. So, for example, we will get a police report, and in the police report, it will say, well, Juan Chacon said this, that, or the other thing to me, and it will put Juan Chacon at fault. Juan Chacon will come to me and will say, I didn't say that. That's not what I said. The officer was bilingual, but he wasn't perfectly bilingual, and I didn't say any of that. And we will get the lapel cam. In other words, the footage that the officer was taking on his lapel cam system, and sure enough, our client will have explained the accident in an entirely different way. The other thing is, and I think this is unfortunately, this is a bit of a prejudice that law enforcement has. But, when you have to deal with somebody who doesn't speak your same language, you tend to go a little bit faster. You try to get through the whole thing as quickly as you can, so you're not actually taking down all that information. So that's the first barrier that we have to overcome. And it's a pretty big barrier. The most important thing is if a client comes to us and says, "Hey, the police report was wrong. I didn't expect, I didn't say what the police report says that I said." We have to believe the client, and we have to find a way to prove that what the client is telling us is really what happened in the accident.
So, tourists and out of state drivers, like say myself, for example, I might use I 25, I 40, and Central every day. So, how would that mix, us out of towners and tourists who don't really know the area show up in cases that you see?
The good thing is that everybody now has GPS. So they've got an onboard navigation system which is telling them, hey, in 1 mile turn right, in a half a mile turn right, in a quarter of a mile turning right. That's obviously a good thing. I'll shift gears with you and tell you that for out of state clients, sometimes when they get into accidents, their case winds up in federal court, and federal court is not a friendly place for any plaintiff to be. So, for example, you'll have an individual who is from Arkansas traveling in New Mexico. They get into an accident. They want to file a lawsuit because there is diversity jurisdiction. In other words, one person from one state making a claim against one person from another state. That means that the case more than likely is going to wind up in federal court unless we, the attorney, can find a creative way to plead the lawsuit. In other words, to allege enough facts in the lawsuit that we can destroy diversity jurisdiction. But a lot of times when we are representing tourists in New Mexico, those cases go to federal court, and federal court is a whole different animal compared to state court.
Without naming anyone, is there a situation that illustrates how a typical Albuquerque crash, one that you may see all the time, but it ended up having an unexpected twist?
Yeah, we just settled a really large case, and I have to be very sort of opaque about the details because this case just settled, lots of confidentiality agreements, et cetera, et cetera. But we just settled a case where we represented a young man who unfortunately died in an accident, and what we initially it appeared that that young man was solely at fault for his accident. What we found out later on, once we filed a lawsuit, is that the vehicle which was also involved in the accident had a driver, a commercial driver, and that commercial driver was on his cell phone at the time of the accident, and the safety equipment on that commercial vehicle was not working correctly and had not worked correctly for a very long time. And that is the kind of thing that because the injuries are so catastrophic, you just say, look, we're going to have to file a lawsuit. We're going to have to dig in. We're going to have to take some depositions, and we're going to have to find out what the truth of the matter is. And once we started doing that, we found a host of information that wasn't listed anywhere in the police report. In fact, the police report put our client completely, solely, 100% at fault for this accident. But you take enough depositions, you turn over enough rocks, you look under those rocks, and you start to find things that build a case for your client. And in this particular situation, we were lucky enough to turn over those rocks. We were lucky enough to do the work, and we found all kinds of things that if you just read the police report, I think 9 out of 10 attorneys would say, no, this isn't a case.
Wow. Well, congratulations on that settlement.
Thank you. I feel very good about it. And yeah, it's a big fee for us. There's no question about that. But, more than anything, it meant that the clients got justice. And sometimes what the clients want is they just want to be heard. They don't want that their loved one died in vain. They don't want, the last memory of their loved one to be, well, he made a fatal mistake and it was all his fault. They want to know somehow that their loved one wasn't completely at fault. It's a terribly emotional moment when you settle a case for a client like that. And in this particular situation, oh my gosh, incredibly, lots of tears everywhere.
hmm Well, rear end collisions are common everywhere, but they show up in Albuquerque a lot. So, what tends to make those crashes more serious than people expect?
Albuquerque is a funny place. And I love it. I love Albuquerque. I love New Mexico. I did not grow up here, but I moved here in 2006. And within, I'd say 6 months of having moved here, I said, this is it. I'm staying in Albuquerque. But we are also somewhat of a lawless place. And I can say that because I have lived in the Midwest. I used to practice law in Michigan and Indiana before I practiced in New Mexico. And people in Albuquerque and people in New Mexico, we still sort of view ourselves as citizens of the Old West, and we don't like being told what to do, and we don't like rules, and we don't like obeying speed limits and things like that. So I would say in general, accidents in Albuquerque, New Mexico, tend to be accidents involving a little bit more speed, a little bit more velocity. We get a fair number of road rage incidents here because yeah, he was mad dogging me, so we were racing back and forth and we were saying something to each other, and then he swerved into my lane and I lost control, and who the heck knows. But in general, those I think are factors in New Mexico that seem to exist here in ways that in other states where I practice, they don't exist.
Well, to wrap up, for listeners who drive these roads every day, what helps them better understand the patterns behind the crashes you see so often?
Just stay off your cell phone. Maintain a distance between your vehicle and the next vehicle. Do whatever you can do to look as far up the road as you can. It's a skill that I learned riding a motorcycle. We have a tendency to look only a short distance in front of us. But if you can shift your gaze further up the road, you will see hazards that most motorists are not going to see, and you can avoid them. Those are the best pieces of advice that I can offer anybody. And for God's sakes, wear your seatbelt. My gosh, wear your seatbelt. Wearing your seatbelt can be the difference between somebody attending your funeral and you attending somebody else's funeral 40 years from now.
I think that is absolutely great advice. Thank you, David, for breaking this down for us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Justice in Two Languages. To learn more about attorney David Elias Idinopulos and his team at Elias Law, visit abogadoelias.com or call David. What's your phone number?
It's a really cool phone number, 505-888-8888, or, as we say in English and in Spanish, muchos ochos.
Well, you'll find resources in English and Spanish to help you understand your rights and feel supported after a crash. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review if you found this episode helpful.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.